So we've just, for those who have been with us, we've just completed John chapter 18. And if we remember, back in there, we see that Jesus has already been arrested. He's already faced 2 trials, or in my opinion, 2 bogus trials. Because if you're familiar with law or legal proceedings, you know that so much things go into it. There's witnesses, there's a defense. When an accusation is brought against someone, there must be some sort of evidence. And we see that wasn't the case in John chapter 18. The 2 persons that he would have went to before already is Annas, one of the high priests there that we see in Judea, who was replaced eventually by Caiaphas, by the Roman Empire. Those 2 guys in particular would have questioned Jesus at length. And when they realized they weren't getting anywhere with him, they were like, hey, we'll pass you on to Pilate. But in passing him on to Pilate, they made it very clear of the accusations. They brought insults against him. And as we would see, if we look at, in particular, Mark, the Gospel of Mark, we don't see it in John. But we heard that some people even made false accusations against him. In particular, Mark chapter 14 and verse 58 said, we heard him say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another, not made by man. And Mark made the point that not even their testimony that they brought against Jesus agreed. So as I said, Caiaphas handed Jesus over to Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea at that time. And together with the Jewish mob, his supporters, they incited the idea that Jesus was some sort of rebel, someone who had intention of overthrowing the Roman Empire. But we saw again, back in chapter 18, that Pilate questioned Jesus for himself. And in verse 38, he said, I find no basis for a charge against this man. He's innocent. He tried to free Jesus under a long-standing Roman tradition. If you remember that, where one prisoner is freed, the tradition was that one prisoner would be freed at the beginning of the Holy Week. He tried doing that, and if you remember the story, they were like, no, we don't want this man. Free Barabbas instead. Now, I find it ironic, because the very accusation that they were bringing against Jesus, that he was leading some sort of rebellion, if you're familiar with who Barabbas is, he himself was a leader of a rebellion, and more than that, a murderer. Very, very ironic. And it paints the picture that we would see as we get into chapter 19 of the Jews, the entire Sanhedrin, and the high priest, their heart towards Jesus. It wasn't a matter of whether Jesus was innocent or not. At the end of the day, he had to go. All right? Before we get into chapter 19, I want to remind us of 2 things. Firstly, Jesus was severely hated by his own people. He was under constant threat from his own countrymen, the Jews. In the end, it was these very men who handed him over to the Romans to be killed. Remember the very first chapter, in verse 11, we saw that John said, he, that is Jesus, came to that which was his own, but his own people did not receive him. Secondly, I want us to remember and recall that Jesus was fully aware of what was going to take place. It didn't take him by surprise. He wasn't clueless as to what was going on. He was fully aware. At one point, we see in chapter 18 that knowing what was about to happen to him, he went out to meet the Roman soldiers. So he was aware. So chapter 19, verses 1 to 5. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, Here is the man. So Pilate was facing clearly a dilemma. On one hand, this man, he have questioned for himself and has already decided that he is innocent. There's no charge that can be found against him. I have questioned in myself. There's nothing that can be placed against him. But on the other hand, you have this Jewish mob, very influential, very powerful. They even make threats further on, you will see in chapter 19, with regards to Jesus. Clearly, they wanted something to happen to Jesus. And in the end, we know that's death. They wanted him to face the death penalty. Just for a little backdrop, around this time, it was the Passover week of celebration. And therefore, Jerusalem here, where they would have did most of the festivities, would have been packed with a number of visitors. Some scholars estimated that it would have had perhaps close to 150,000 extra persons visiting Jerusalem at the time. Certainly around this time, they would have had a number of these 150,000 persons, as well as the residents of Jerusalem at that time, who would have favored Jesus. We see right through John that there was the idea that Jesus was the long prophesied and awaited Messiah, who would eventually come and overthrow the Roman Empire. All right? So we know that there were supporters of Jesus in the midst of this gathering. But it was a big deal. What was happening here? Passover week, the Passover celebration, kind of like our Independence Day that we celebrate around the world, here in St. Kitts, and I know in the US, and the kind of preparations that go into them. The last thing Pilate wanted with an atmosphere like this, so many additional visitors in town, so many supporters, the last thing he wanted was some sort of social or political unrest, some sort of revolt. And this is the atmosphere it had then. People didn't agree. Some people wanted Jesus dead, but so many other followers, and just that tension from both sides. And definitely Caiaphas and the rest of the Jews played on that tension. At the same time, Jews were being adamant on a guilty Jesus who needed to face the death penalty. And as we are getting ready to see in a bit, they played on Pilate's insecurities, almost suggesting that Jesus was a threat to Rome. Needless to say that it was a very delicate situation with a fragile socio-political environment. Tension. So what did Pilate do? And we see here in verse 1 that Pilate had Jesus flogged. According to the version that of the Bible that you have, it would read scourged. In an attempt to satisfy the Jews' appetite for blood and his own guilty conscience by not having to crucify Jesus, Pilate had Jesus flogged. This scourging was designed only to pacify the Jews, and in it, Pilate put a compliment on them. What he did in essence is that he questioned Jesus. He've already found him not guilty. At that point, as we know, in any legal system, if someone is declared innocent, what's the next stage? To free that person, not so? But we see here that Pilate, on top of knowing that he was innocent, had him flogged. This flogging was not to be underestimated, for the Romans used whips made of several leather strips, and in those leather strips, they embedded lead and pieces of bones. Under the Jewish system, there was a restriction to 40 lashes. Under the Roman system, there weren't any such restrictions. And if you look through history, you would see cases that in most cases, persons who were flogged under the Roman law didn't survive. For the very least, this beating would have left Jesus' back in shreds and bleeding continuously. After this wasn't the end of it, as we see in verse 2 and 3. Pilate handed him over to the soldiers and allowed them to inflict further pain and to make sport of him. They made together a crown of thorns, thorn briars, and if you're familiar with the species of plants on that side of the world, those thorns under such a climate would have grown very, very long. And I imagine these Roman soldiers, after fastening this, the whole idea was to make a mockery out of the entire situation, to humiliate him, to scorn him. Hey, you are the king? You are some king? Well, look, here's your crown. And I imagine when they placed this crown on his head, they would have pushed it down. Needless to say that Jesus, by now, would have been a mess, bleeding profusely, fatigued, humiliated, embarrassed. This was the Lord's Son. However, this is Jesus. We know that, yes, he came as a man to the earth, and it had purpose in that. But he was also the Son of God. We saw back in chapter 18 just the power he had in using his voice and what had happened to strong Roman soldiers. They fell to the ground. At this point, I want to imagine that Jesus can put his own beating upon these Roman soldiers in any form that you could imagine. But what did he do? Nothing. Nothing here is recorded to say that he defended himself, he raised an arm, he said, hey, don't hit me. I am the Son of God. Notice the grace, contentment, courage, and peace with which Jesus received this unjust brutality and scorn. He didn't strike back. He didn't even put up a guard. Isn't this a great example for us believers who live in sometimes an unjust and unfair world? Under persecution, under threats, we face things, we are humiliated and scorned if we identify with Jesus. But may we take courage that the fact that Jesus, being clearly innocent, even being told that he was innocent, that he was able to face these things, and yet he did it gracefully, courageously, and without retaliating. And sometimes, I know I am guilty of that. Sometimes I face an unfair situation and I lash out. Because I know I'm entitled to my rights. I know my rights. And I know you can't do me this. I lash out. I'm not saying that there isn't a time to stand up for what is right. There isn't a time to open your mouth and defend yourself. But maybe, may we know and be able to discern when that time is. When we should keep silent and when we should open our mouth. Theologian and Bible commentator Matthew Henry puts it this way. He endured the pain, not the pangs of death only. Shall we complain of a thorn in the flesh and of being buffeted by affliction because we need to hide pride from us? When Christ humbled himself to bear those thorns in his head and those buffetings to save and teach us, he despised the shame of a fool's coat and the mock respect paid to him with, Hail, King of the Jews. If we be at any time ridiculed for well-doing, let us not be ashamed, but glorify God, for thus we are partakers of Christ's suffering. Even after the beating, Pilate said in verse 4, Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. The original language there, no basis, it implies that there wasn't even a motive to raise a charge for Jesus to commit any particular crime, for them to raise this charge. There was no motive. He brought him out, again, all bloodied and fatigued this time, and he said, Here is the man. Notice that he said that to the end of verse 5. Here is the man. Not here is the acclaimed king that you guys have been saying. Not here is the rebel, as you suppose. Pilate is here suggesting that, hey, I have questioned this Jesus, this man that you think is a threat to yourself and to the Roman Empire. And I have declared him. I don't see him as king's material. He is not a rebel in my eyes. Here is the man. Verses 6 to 7. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, Crucify! Crucify! But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. This is the second time. In fact, the third time. Verse 7, the Jews insisted, We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. Evidently, it was a deliberate attempt to incite this death sentence upon an innocent man. They've made it clear time and time again that they were not interested in having a legal proceeding to determine whether he was innocent or guilty. The Jewish leaders, and Pilate even recognized this. We don't see it here in John again, but as we flip through the rest of the Gospels, the other Gospels, we see that Pilate himself came to the conclusion that these men were just jealous and had utter hatred towards Jesus. For a third time, Pilate declares that he found no reason for Jesus to be condemned. There was nothing to go on according to Roman legal standards. And this points to the fact that Pilate was very conscious of what was happening. He had a conscience, he was convicted, and knew that something was fishy here, something was happening. How did the Jews respond? Because Pilate said, hey, I found no basis. There's no charge, nothing credible. And basically the Jews are saying, well, here's what. According to your standards, your legal standards, he's not guilty. But we have a standard, and according to our law, this man has been found guilty. And on top of that, he is punishable by death. Now, we're not even sure that Pilate was aware of Jewish standards and what was written in the law. At this point, they could have said anything and just slapped the death sentence to the end, and Pilate would be none the wiser. But at this point, the Jews were referencing a particular Mosaic covenant, and we see that in Leviticus 24, verse 16, just for reference. It reads, anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord, which is to disrespect the name of the Lord, must be put to death. The entire assembly must stone him, whether an alien or native born. When he blasphemes the name, he must be put to death. So according to the Jews, this was the conviction. This was the charge, that Jesus was guilty of disrespecting the name of God for equating himself or calling himself God's son. And well, since they were forbidden under the Roman Empire to exact any sort of killing, they were like, hey, he's not guilty by your law, he's guilty by our law. But since we can't kill him, here's him. You carry out the justice. You carry out the killing. However, we know on this side that Jesus was not guilty of blasphemy. Why? Because he was, in fact, the Son of God. And the truth is that the Jews hated and were so jealous of Jesus that they couldn't even see this. And we see this right through the book of John, that he did miracles. He taught in such a way that people have never saw before, never heard before. He said back in chapter 10, verse 37 to 38, he said, do not believe me unless I do what my Father does. But if I do it, even though you do not believe me, believe the miracles, that you may know and understand that the Father, God, is in me and I in the Father, that we are one and equal. Don't believe what I said. Even if you don't believe what I said and what I did, believe the miracles. It's not every day you find people walking around raising a dead man to life. Believe that at least gives some credible facts for what I'm saying. It authenticates me as God's son. As a Jewish man, Jesus would have been aware of Jewish law and the provision under it that blasphemy was punishable by death. So here's a point I want to make, that if Jesus was a mere man, as some suppose, he would have been familiar with the Jewish covenant, and that if he lied about this, which is like committing a capital offense, he would have faced the death sentence. So if he did lie about being the Son of God, why risk death? Why risk death? Why say that he was the Son of God over and over, knowing that there's a chance that he will be placed to death? And I think it just points to the fact that it was in fact true. This is the truth. Today, the world is filled with similar people. Similar in the sense of the heart that they have the heart that the Jews had at this point. They are not particularly interested in whether Jesus is who he said he is or not. They don't care to find out whether the miracles he did and the messages he professed could authenticate his existence or not. Like the Jewish prosecutors, there's an utter hatred towards him that screams, hey, get away from me, Jesus. You don't align with my standards. Here's my standards. You stay here. I will have my standards. Forget the logical and rational questions that all of us as humans can ask. Jesus has to go. This is the attitude that some persons have in the world. It doesn't matter whether you say he is true or not, or whether it could be validated or not. This doesn't line up with my standard, and Jesus has to go. I really hope that's not the case with any of us here. And if we are at that point that we can, in any, as I said, in any legal proceeding, usually the person who is being accused is allowed at some point, not all the time, but in many cases, to make a statement, to declare themselves and to say something, some sort of rebuttal, to defend themselves. This is almost like the defense of Jesus, of God. And yet still, in most cases, is not allowed to stand under any sort of trial. People just throw it away and choose to believe that, hey, he doesn't exist. This can't be real. Verses 8 to 11. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and then he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Verse 11, Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater crime. So we see here in verse 11, Pilate was afraid of the accusation, the claim that Jesus is the Son of God. And again, it points to something happening in here in Pilate's heart. Some conscience, something prodding him, something is up here. So he asks Jesus the question, where do you come from? Now, I don't think is that Pilate was interested in getting to know who Jesus was at this point. Certainly not at this point. For sure. And I think it's a matter where Pilate was giving Jesus a chance to defend himself. For surely such a great teacher, this is Jesus, and a well-respected speaker, could offer a defense that would lead to his clearing. I'm sure that's what's going through Pilate's mind at this point. And John doesn't record it, but we see in Matthew chapter 27, verse 13, a parallel passage, that Pilate says to Jesus, hey, don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you? It's as if to say, hey, open your mouth. Defend yourself. Say something. Set yourself free. These people are bringing some sort of accusation against you. Offer some sort of defense. And what was Jesus' response we see here? There was no response. He said nothing. He offered no rebuttal. He didn't make a counter statement. He didn't make a plea. He was silent. Isaiah 53 verse 7 prophesied about this particular event. Hundreds of years before it took place, it says, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. It's almost like Jesus was like, hey, let's get on with this. I know what I've come for. I've come for this very reason. Take me to the cross. I'm not going to offer any sort of arguments. And again, may we as Christians learn to discern when to do that, when to open our mouth and say something, and when not to. And I know, I fail at that miserably, time and time again, of knowing when to just shut up. At home, in the workplace, on the road, in front of the law, police officers. There's a time for everything, a time to defend and a time to just stay silent. Pilate is baffled at this point. And he reminds Jesus, hey, I'm the boss. I have the power to free you. I have the power to crucify you. It suggests to me that Pilate was very conscious of his image and his appearance before men. And at the end of the day, that's what it came down to. How people perceived him, whether as a strong leader, a weak leader, or someone who can be manipulated. According to Pilate's own words, he had the power to determine whether Jesus should be freed or crucified. He was not clueless as to how much weight he had in the matter. How possible would it have been for Pilate to free Jesus? Very possible. Difficult? Perhaps. Would it have some sort of political backlash? Maybe. But it was in Pilate's ability, both physical and mental. He was quite aware that he could free Jesus or send him to the cross. At this statement, Jesus answered, hey, you have no power over me except that which has been given to you from above. And we saw as we've been going through the book of Daniel on Wednesday night Bible studies, just to put a plug in there, that God continuously reminds great and influential and powerful men, hey, the authority and power that you have, it came from me. I am the one who gave you this power. And just as how I can give it to you, it's just so I can take it away from you. And it's the same thing that happens in our world today. It's the same thing that happens today. God is the one who has assigned power to kingdoms, to kings, to presidents, to our teachers, to our lecturers, to our principals. As difficult as they can be at times, God is the one who have appointed them and placed them in those positions. Daniel's prayer in chapters 2 and verse 21 echoes this truth. He said, it is he, that is God, who sets up kings and he who deposes them. Then in Romans 13 and verse 1, Paul reminds us of this fact again. It says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. And then he said it again in another way. The authorities that exist have been established by God. At the same time, Jesus sends Pilate this subtle message. If we see there at the end of verse 11, it says, therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. God gives the power to you, Pilate, just as how he had given the power to Caiaphas, to Judas even, and to the rest of the persons who handed me over to you. Here's what. They are guilty of a greater sin. They had the power to decide whether to hand me over to you, but they didn't. As it is right now, they are guilty of a greater sin. You are still guilty. Don't think that you are not guilty of sin. And it points to, there's a point in there that I want to bring out, that not because he is guilty of a greater sin means that Pilate was innocent. And Jesus I think is trying to make this clear. Yes, they are guilty of a greater sin, but you don't make the same mistake. You can determine, you have the power to determine whether I go to the cross or whether I'm released. But on top of that, be certain of this. You flogged me. You have me in this position. You have gone against your own conscience that have been plodding against you. You know the truth, but yet you decided to exact some sort of unjust punishment to me. And it's just a reminder to us that when we stand before God, we won't be able to state anyone else's sin but ours. We will give account for no one else's sin but our own. But Lord, I wasn't a murderer. I was a good person. I crossed the old lady the street. I gave to the poor. I didn't curse. I didn't do those things. But at the end of the day, God is going to judge every one of us according to our sins, our personal sins, and we will give account for them and no one else. Isn't it mind-blowing that in the midst of our free will, the free will that he has given to men, in whatever power they have, that God's sovereign will can still be unfolded. It can still come to pass. God in his sovereign plan sets up leaders and rulers across the surface of the earth, gives them power to make choices that will affect the outcome of matters, some so large that it will change the course of history. Yet, God determines that men's free will would be a vehicle by which his sovereign will is unfolded. And this was the case with Judas, right up to Pilate. In their free will, they accomplished the purpose of God, which was to send Jesus to the cross. Verses 12 to 13. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. So we see that in verse 12, after Jesus' response, conviction mixed with some sort of fear grips Pilate, to the point where he make another attempt to free Jesus, knowing that he was innocent. However, clearly the Jews weren't happy with this. As I said before, they didn't they didn't care whether he was innocent or not. There was one outcome in their mind for this Jesus, and that was death. Again, the Jews played on Pilate's political insecurities to force him to treat Jesus unfairly. And that's why they mention it. It's like, if you let this man go, you are no friend of your boss. Basically, you are aligning yourself with Jesus and going against your boss. It was a threat. Basically, you make sure you kill this man and show that you are a friend of Caesar and you are for Caesar and you're not for Jesus. So what did Pilate do? He sits down on the judge's seat, signifying that he was about to make some sort of decision, some verdict. Neither the Gospel of John, nor does the other Gospels record it. But in Matthew chapter 27 again, we are told that around this time, Pilate's wife sent a strong message to him concerning the matter. And we can read this in Matthew chapter 27, verse 19. It says, "While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: 'Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him.'" Isn't that crazy? She's wherever she is, was sleeping clearly, and she had a dream. Hey, don't have anything to do with this innocent man. He's innocent. I've suffered a great deal about him. I mean, if Pilate wasn't aware, wasn't too sure before what to do with him, I mean, his wife sent a message to him. Don't have anything to do with this man. Verses 14 to 16. It was the day of preparation of the Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away. Take him away. Crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests replied. Verse 16. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So we see there in verse 14, it was the day of preparation of the Passover week, which according to Jewish calendar would have fallen on a Friday, and it was about the 6th hour. And again, if we do some rough calculation, that would have been around 12 noon, if John was in fact using the Jewish way of telling time. But for a third time, Pilate makes an attempt to spare Jesus' life, this time trying to simply handing him back to the Jewish leaders. And however, the Jews rose in uproar and demanded that he crucified Jesus. Crucify him. Crucify him. Take him away. Crucify him. They were so determined on having Jesus killed that they were willing to do what? The Romans, I don't know if we have the picture, but the Romans took over Israel at this point. They had them under oppression. They weren't their friends. They weren't even cordial with them at times. Yet, the Jews hated Jesus so much that they were willing to say that he is not our friend. He is not our king. Caesar is our king. Pilate, even you is our governor. We align ourselves with you. We don't align ourselves with Jesus. Their own sworn enemies. And what did Pilate do? As we see in verse 16, he handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. What irony. How lost were they that they couldn't even see that they hated Jesus so much that they would side with their enemies just so that they would crucify this innocent man. Couple points. Pilate tried continuously for a middle course, continuously, that he could save both Jesus and clear his conscience, but at the same time appease the unbending Jews. First, he tried, as we see, he tried to free Jesus under the long-held Roman custom. Then he flogged him, hoping that would appetite satisfy the Jews. Then he tried to release him just like that. That didn't work either. For Pilate, it came down to this in the end, a choice in the end. Do I honor Jesus or do I appease men? And what did he do? Pilate chose his reputation in the end among men over his conscience and over the reputation and truth of Jesus. We see in Matthew 27 again, verse 24, that Pilate ordered around the same time, he called for a basin of water. He's like, bring the basin. And at this point, he washed his hands in front of the crowd. He was like, here's what, I have nothing to do with this. I'm giving it over to you. The responsibility is yours. A coward act. But isn't this what the world is like today? That some people may not necessarily deny the existence and truth that Jesus existed and that he still exists today. He's still the Son of God. It's not that they necessarily don't believe that, hey, that this man would have possibly walked the surface of the earth and did good teachings and possibly even did some miracles. They're not necessarily against him or have any direct or active hatred towards him. But in an effort to appease themselves, in an effort to appease men, friends, their spouse, they wash their hands of anything to do with Jesus. This may even be the truth among some persons who profess to believe in Jesus. They profess with their mouth that, yes, I believe in Jesus, I call myself a Christian, but in the way that they live their lives, they are saying to themselves and the entire world that I rather side with men's standards, with the world's standards, with my friends' standards, than to side with what Jesus, the truth of Jesus. I know I struggled with this for a long time during my walk with the Lord. And I remember at the beginning of every semester, I would say, I'm going to class and I'm going to declare and announce by the way that I live that I'm a Christian. Sooner or later, second week, if so long, I'm doing something that says otherwise, that, hey, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I can go to this party. I can drink and get drunk, fall along on myself. I can say these things that I know that I shouldn't say, sound cool, and look like you guys. But in essence, I was showing them that, hey, your opinion of me and by your standards of me, that's more important than what I stand for, than what my conscience says. Psalm chapter 2, verse 12 reminds us that kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. May we all take refuge in Jesus, not like Pilate and not like the unbending Jews. From Judas to Caiaphas, to Pilate and the Jews, these people were instruments in carrying out God's sovereign plan to have his Son come into the world and die for the sins of all men. That is to say that we are all guilty of nailing Jesus to the cross. You know, we can again stand back almost, put ourselves away from the entire event and think to ourselves we had no part in it. But it's for our very sins, the sins of the entire world, Jesus came. Placed himself willingly to be arrested, crucified for our sins. Isaiah 53 verse 6 says, we, all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him, that is, on Jesus, the iniquity of us all. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. We are all guilty of sin, according to Romans 6:23. And the only reward for sin is death. God did this. He placed his wrath on his son by sending him to the cross to take the sins of the entire world upon himself. Side note, on the matter of if there's a God, why does he allow bad things to happen to good people? I've heard that question several times, and I'm sure you've heard as well. Without challenging what a good person looks like in our world today, let's consider what he allowed his only son to face. For his glory and by his sovereign will, he allowed his innocent son, he was without sin, the Bible says, to be captured, scorned, ridiculed, tortured, and eventually crucified in the vilest way, so that the very men who murdered him would have a chance to be redeemed to God forever. If God allowed his son, his innocent son, to be falsely accused and murdered, how much more is he justified in doing and dealing with sinful men as his sovereign will determines? If he allowed his only innocent son to face death and unjust treatment, then who are we to question what a good and great innocent God does to guilty men in the world today? May we not be like Pilate and wash our hands of Jesus' death, because we are all guilty and in need of his saving grace. For this reason, Christ came, that all men may have eternal life.